So I want to take a little bit of time at the start of class today to talk about the assignment that's due tonight, to talk about the homework that goes with it that's due next week, and then the assignment that's due the following week. So today, a week from today, and 2 weeks from today, each time there's a deadline for an assignment. The one that's due tonight is the article report. So you were assigned a partner. You and your partner were to pick an article from among the options, read it, talk to each other about it, make your video where you talked about each of the elements in the assignment instructions. You have until midnight tonight to make that video, to post a link to it in the forum in Moodle. 7 days from now, the little assignment, let me take a step back. Tomorrow, probably morning, you will receive an email from me, and it will tell you which other partnership you are now assigned to watch their video, pay attention to the article they reviewed, and then ask them a question. Now that question, there are details about it in the assignment, but it should be a question that you ask because you're curious, and the one that encourages them to go a little deeper, to dig in a little more and think hard about the study. So the thing that's due between now and next week is for you and your partner to watch the video you're assigned, and then to come up with the question you want to ask of the other partners. You have full 7 days to do that. 2 weeks from now, the assignment that is due is the field report assignment. And a while back, you were assigned a partner in this class, and you and your partner were to go to a public place and watch people until you saw several nonverbal cues that you and your partner did not interpret the same way. And after you've done that people watching, then there is a quiz that you fill out, and it has questions to answer about the experience. And when you've filled it out and submitted it, you're done with that assignment. That's due 2 weeks from today, at the end of the day, at midnight. So, what we are talking about right now, and I will invite you to ask me questions. The article report, asking a question about the article report, the field report, 3 different assignments. Are there any of the 3 that you'd like to ask me anything about? There's still time to do all 3. Yes, ma'am.
We don't have to answer the question, we just have to ask questions.
In case you couldn't hear the question, it was, so you'll post your report and then someone else in the class is going to ask you a question, and the question was, so we don't have to answer them? No, you are not assigned to answer the question. My hope is you'll go back and look at the question and think about it. And if it's a really good, thoughtful, provocative question, that you'll have a moment. And that's all that I'm really after with the asking of the question. Good question, thank you. Good, provocative question. Do we have other questions about any of the 3 assignments? I have learned that sometimes people have questions but feel reluctant to ask them in front of the class. Let me urge you, if you have a question right now that you're not asking, please email it to me. There really is time to get all these assignments done, and it will break my heart if your work doesn't come in, or it comes in done very incorrectly, and it was something we could have caught if I just knew in time what your question was. All right. I wanted to do that at the start of class. I have decided there's one other thing I want to do before we get to the day's subject matter. This will involve switching between two of these, which I'm a little nervous about because already the equipment has been ornery today. We are, you will gather, approaching the very end of the class. We only have 2 more meetings after this one. There's something for almost my entire 30 years of teaching college students that I like to do, and I want to invite you to be part of if you choose near the end of a class. I invite my students to get together and I take a class picture. This was my communication theory class last spring. I knew I was headed this way, so we took this picture under the cherry blossom tree we have on campus back in Oregon. This I took about 10 years ago. It's the last class meeting of my conflict class. They're having a little fist fight because they thought that would be a funny thing to do at the end of a conflict class. This guy who needs a haircut is 1 semester away from finishing his doctorate in communication, and he is currently teaching lots of my classes back in the United States while I'm here. And I'm teaching not only here, but also at Tsuda. And these are some of the students who took my argumentation and debate class over at Tsuda. Now, a few weeks ago, I went and I got one of these. I don't actually know what it is. I haven't opened it. But I also have one of these, a pennant from my university. These are props. At the end of class, with just a couple of minutes left, I'm going to issue an invitation, not a requirement. You are invited. If you'd rather not be in a picture at all, it'll be perfectly okay with me if you go and are early in line to get lunch. But I'll take 2 pictures. The first picture is for me only. Nobody else will see it. In my office, I have an electronic frame. Well, people who come to my office will see it. But I have an electronic frame, and every few seconds, it switches to another picture. And I have at this point 600 or 700 pictures. The second picture I take, I admit, and this is what I did with this picture, I have an Instagram account. I don't like Instagram. I don't like social media. But my students and my colleagues in the United States begged me. They said, please put up pictures. We want to know how you're doing. And my students in Oregon are so curious about you. I put this one up and they went berserk. They loved seeing my students over here. So you are invited. You don't have to be in either picture. If you'd rather not be in the picture that will go on Instagram, you could be in the first but not the second. That will happen at the end of class. Now, speaking of class, let me get back over to the presentation that is about today's subject matter. Bump, bump. Today will be a little bit different from most of the class meetings until now. I'm going to start it by telling you a story, a true story that happened to me in the summer of 2019. Now, I was reading that in Japan, having juries with trials, when a trial happens in a courtroom, having a jury is pretty new. There have only been juries, and they're called lay judges in Japan since 2009, so about 14 years. In the United States, having a jury when someone is accused of a crime and put on trial, we've had that probably the whole history of the country, 200 years. And in summer of 2019, I was summoned to come down to the courthouse to be available to serve on a jury. So when that happens, they bring you in and they ask you questions to make sure that you belong on that trial and you can be fair and you can render a fair decision as part of the jury. Some of the questions they ask, if it's a trial for murder or for robbery, they'll say, has anyone in your family been murdered? Have you been robbed? Because if it happened to you, you might not be fair. They'll ask you, what is your job? What do you do for a living? What is your work? And they'll say, is there anything about your job that would stop you from being fair. And that day, when I was called and they were considering whether to put me on a jury, they kept asking everybody, when you're talking to someone and you don't think they're telling you the truth, how can you tell? And as I sat there and listened to them question these other members of the jury, they would answer that question by saying, well, if someone won't look me in the eye, if someone seems really nervous, then I think they're not telling me the truth. And the lawyers really liked that answer, and they kept picking people to be on the jury if they gave that answer. Well, finally, it was my turn. And they asked me, what's your job? What work do you do? And I said, I'm a communication professor. And they said, is there anything about that job we should know that would interfere with you being on the jury? Here's what I said. I said, you've been asking all these other people how they can tell when someone's not telling them the truth. And they keep saying, well, if someone looks nervous or won't look you in the eye, that's how you know. Well, I have to say, that's not what the research says. People are not reliable when they try to judge whether other people are telling the truth by looking at their nonverbals. And the lawyers, they turned and they looked at each other and they said to the judge, this man is excused. And they did not put me on the jury because they did not want those other jury members hearing that. And that made me very sad because it's the truth. So what we are talking about today is, I have two objectives today. One objective, I would really like to unteach you something that a lot of people believe and they are wrong. The thing I want to unteach you is the idea that you can tell if people are lying by looking at their nonverbal communication. The second objective I have today is I'm going to give you a little bit of a look at how social science research happens. Because the truth about detecting deception is itself pretty controversial, and a lot of researchers don't agree. Now, we talked about a controversy before when we talked about basic emotion theory and behavioral ecology theory. Today, I don't expect that you have had research methods or that you know a lot about statistics. But I'm going to try to show you that often what you have is you have data, and there are two different ways of interpreting the data, and both of them are kind of right. And you have to decide what's going on here. And that's what happens in the research on whether people can detect deception. Now, the idea that you can detect, that you can tell if someone's lying to you just by looking at their nonverbals has two sources. We talked about these at the beginning of the class. One of them is what we call folk wisdom. Folk wisdom. Just kind of an everybody knows type thing. One example. All around the world, it is believed mistakenly that if someone will not look you in the eye, it means that they're lying to you. A team of cross-cultural psychologists in, I think the publication year was 2010, they examined this mistaken belief in 75 different countries, including Japan. They asked an open-ended question. How can you tell when someone's not telling you the truth? And in that open-ended question, the number one answer, 60% of people gave this, they won't look you in the eye. But set it up in experimental conditions. If you're trying to convince someone of a lie, you look them right in the eye. And if you're talking to someone about an uncomfortable subject, you're likely not to look them in the eye. And that's the problem. People who say that you can detect deception, they like to list certain nonverbals and say, if you see this nonverbal, it means they're lying. But some people learn about those and learn not to do them. And other people will use those nonverbals when they are telling the truth if they are uncomfortable. So the first source, there are lots of people who say, oh, you can always tell. The second source, At the first class meeting, I talked about folk wisdom. I also talked about something that I called hogwash. Hogwash. That's where someone who has credentials and should know better, they will write what gets them attention, and they will make money off it. And sadly, there's a very famous researcher. Today, actually, is the story of 3 researchers. The first of these is a man named Paul Ekman. Now, we have referred to Paul Ekman before when we talked about basic emotion theory. Paul Ekman is far and away the star researcher into what do facial expressions mean, what emotion are people showing. He's considered the founder of basic emotions theory. Now, after he had become very distinguished and famous because of basic emotions theory, he moved into a new area of research. He started to make claims that you can always tell when someone's lying. And actually, I have this in a strange order. Let me briefly introduce the other 2 researchers. This one is Judy Burgoon. She is a communication professor. This one is Timothy Levine. He's also a communication professor. We will come back to them. Paul Ekman. He started to make the claim you can always tell when people are lying because of what are called micro-expressions. So, be scandalized. I'm going to take my mask off for a second because I'm going to demonstrate this. I don't know if you've ever had to say something that was very funny but with a straight face, and so you start to and just a little bit of laughter kind of comes out. That's not a micro-expression. He would say a normal expression is about half a second up to 2 seconds, 0.5 seconds to 2 seconds. He would say a micro-expression is 1/4 of a second or less. You almost need a video camera to spot them because most people will not spot them. So if I say, that was a micro-expression, I just twitched a little bit, so quickly it may not have registered. But he started making the claim, when people are saying something, and from the video you can catch micro-expressions, it means they're lying. Now I have to tell you, he's still alive, he's still doing experiments, he's still publishing the results. He retired from his professor position in 2004, 19 years ago, when everybody in here was a small child, or possibly not even born. Since then, he's worked for his own think tank, Paul Ekman International, and he doesn't submit any of his research for peer review because he says his work is so urgent that people need it right away and peer review is too slow. It results in delay. In the United States, there were programs put in place in airports where airport security screeners were trained to use his research and his methods to spot liars. And it became very controversial because it wasn't working and the program had to be canceled. But because he is distinguished, because he is famous, there was a television show in the United States called Lie to Me that was based on him and his work. And it was on for 5 or 6 seasons, as I recall, and quite popular. But this may be one of the best examples of hogwash that I can think of. So I'm about to stop talking about Paul Ekman, but I am trying to prepare you for the fact that after this class ends, if you try to say to people, actually the research shows that people, human beings, are not accurate when we try to detect deception based on nonverbals. Someone's going to say to you, no, I read. Scientists proved you can tell when people are lying. They have this thing they do on their face. It's called a micro-expression. Well, you've heard of it now. And it is very, very methodologically problematic. Other researchers can't replicate his findings. He doesn't submit them for peer review. It's just a mess. Everybody else, there is consensus among people who study this. Your accuracy at detecting whether someone's telling the truth based on their nonverbals, your accuracy is about 54%. Now, random chance between saying this is true or this is not true would be 50%. So if you just guessed, you could manage 50% over large data sets. When you're trying your best over a large enough data set, you will come in at about 54%, which is so small, it's trivial. One more thing before I get to talking about the state of research. Well, two more things. There's really two separate questions here. Can you tell if someone is not telling you the truth because of the way they behave? The two versions of that question are, is it ever possible to tell? And the other version is, can you do it consistently enough to rely on it? The answer to the first one is yes. Sometimes you can tell. Sometimes people behave so strangely that it's just obvious something's wrong. But some people think that they can always tell, or they can tell consistently enough that they can rely on that. And that's where folk wisdom, you have a couple of experiences where you catch someone being dishonest with you because of their nonverbals. You start to tell yourself that's a talent you have, and then confirmation bias takes over. And every time you're wrong, you forget it. And the times that you're lucky and you're right, you remember it, and you say to yourself, see, I can always tell. So, the fact that I am going to make the case that people are not accurate, you may have experiences someday where someone's nonverbals tip you off. That happens. But the case I'm trying to make is you shouldn't count on it. The other thing I want to say before we get into this, people's verbal content, the things that they say, the details that come out of their mouth, that's how you detect deception. I'm going to mention this again at the end of class today, but the big trend in research now for detecting deception is non-behavioral methods, which is to say, listen to what they actually say. Ask them to repeat what they said and see if the details change, not in little ways, but in major ways. Listen to the content. Don't waste your time on the nonverbals. With that in mind, let us now get to Judy Burgoon. Judy Burgoon is at this point, I would argue, the leading researcher into deception in the communication field. She's a professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona. This is her work, Interpersonal Deception Theory. Now she says, for you to understand her model, there are 3 bits of prior work that it's important to understand. One of them is the leakage hypothesis. The leakage hypothesis. And interestingly, the leakage hypothesis is the work of Paul Ekman. So I'm not saying the guy is wrong about everything. I'm not saying the guy is evil. I'm saying the set of incentives he has right now, he's being very irresponsible. But he's a brilliant man, and some of his past work is very useful. The leakage hypothesis. This says, when you tell somebody else a lie, that act produces states in your brain and also in your body. So it produces thoughts, feelings, and physical reactions, and those sometimes can be observed. Leaked emotions are hard to conceal because they tend to be primary emotions, not blended emotions. They tend to be fear, they tend to be anger, and people don't tend to leak, goes the hypothesis, on their face quite as much as in their voice and in their body. So one of the interesting elements of the leakage hypothesis is a lot of people, Ekman's later work on microexpressions had everybody looking at the face. But the changes that are inconsistently detectable, a lot of them show up in your voice. Your voice may break. Your voice may sound tense. Your voice may go higher in pitch. Those are things that we sometimes do as a result of the internal states when we're being deceptive. We also will sometimes change our posture. We may sit still. We may draw in. We may not sit in a relaxed state and move comfortably the way we would in an ordinary conversation. And one of the claims that went with the leakage hypothesis is, when you're trying to lie and you're trying to be believable, you pay most attention to what's on your face. Because we use our face expressively. And we don't use what our torso is doing expressively as often, so we're not as good at it. Now, we do use our voice expressively, but we don't have as much fine-tuning rehearsal with our voice as we do with our face. So the leakage hypothesis said, whatever can be detected, maybe it's detected on the face, more commonly, the voice and other movements. The second thing that Burgoon said, if you want to understand interpersonal deception theory, you need to understand four-factor theory. Four-factor theory says, you remember how I said with the leakage hypothesis, there are states in your brain, in your body. Four-factor theory said what they were. And they were, first of all, arousal, physical arousal. You do not tend, when you are lying, you do not tend to be relaxed. You do not tend to be letting your mind wander. You tend to focus. Your heart rate may speed up a little bit. Your muscles may tense a little bit. Your body, your metabolism, just amps up a little bit. Your body speeds up its behavior a little bit. That's one of the four. The second one is negative affect. Negative affect, which is to say, you are likely to experience, even if only mildly, an emotion that is negative. You may feel ashamed. You may feel guilty. You may feel afraid of getting caught. You may feel irritated that someone put you in a situation where you needed to say something dishonest. Maybe they asked you an awkward question and you had to lie to cover up. But four-factor theory says, at the moment you say something deceptive, you tend to experience negative affect. That's the second factor. The third factor, cognitive processing. Cognitive processing. Now, cognitive just means brain activity that is thinking, not experiencing. So when you tell a lie, you think very hard about what words to use. And in particular, if you have to talk more about something you said that was dishonest, you have to think about, now, what did I say? Because you try to say it consistently every time. So you think very hard. If I asked any of you to just tell me what you did this morning, and you talked through your activities this morning, the events of this day, and you were telling the truth, well, it's easy. You could probably do that without thinking hard. But if I said, make up a story of what happened this morning where every detail is wrong, you'd have to think a lot harder. And if I then challenged you to tell it again without any of the details changing, you would think really hard. So, there's arousal, there's negative affect, there's cognitive processing, and the fourth factor is attempted control. Attempted control. That is where you try to look believable. You try to not give it away. You try to look very innocent. How could anybody doubt me? You try to not sound nervous. If you know that your hands shake when you say something dishonest, maybe you sit on your hands. You become very consciously alert, like an actor playing a part in a play. So four-factor theory says that's what's going on when you are being dishonest that may change your communication behavior. Now, the thing that makes this complicated, the reason people's accuracy is so low, those four factors all happen When you tell the truth and someone doesn't believe you. When you are trying to defend yourself against an accusation of being dishonest, in that situation you experience arousal, negative affect, cognitive processing, and attempted control. So those factors do not separate dishonesty from honesty. And finally, commonplace lies, lies that are not unusual, lies that you tell all the time, those don't generate the cues. Maybe you have a grandparent who they make you what they think is your favorite dish, and you really hate it. But you want to be nice, and you want to be respectful, and so you tell them you love it, and you've been doing this for years. You've done it over and over again. At this point, it's just habit. Or maybe Christmas is coming around, and there are small children in your family, and you tell a lot of lies about Santa Claus. Lies like that are habits, that are not really controversial, those don't produce the 4 factors. The third thing that Burgoon said you need to understand before you get into interpersonal deception theory is the motivated impairment, and I didn't fix that typo. That should be motivation, T-I-O-N instead of T-E-D. Sorry about that. The motivation impairment effect. A deceiver who is very, very motivated. When you're saying something dishonest, and it's very important that the person believe you, in that situation, you give off more cues. There are more things you do non-verbally that someone might be able to detect. You're more likely to have leakage. Less motivated observers, they give cues, but they give them in their content. Less motivated observers are likely, because they don't think as hard about making their story consistent, they are a lot more likely to have a very inconsistent story. So, if you have to make up something deceptive because someone you barely know asks you a question that's awkward and you don't really care what this person thinks about you and you may never see them again, you might tell a sloppy or a clumsy lie. They might point out that they don't think that's correct. You're not very motivated. Motivated impairment effect also says, when you manage your message, you polish the content, but you have a harder time. The act of polishing your content is what shows and what can be observed. All right. So those are all the backstory. The leakage hypothesis, 4-factor theory, and the motivation impairment effect. That brings us then to the elements of interpersonal deception theory. This is a model. She says, first of all, you need to consider the deceiver and the target. The deceiver and the target. And probably the biggest premise that got her started studying deception. She says there's a problem in everybody else's study of deception, beginning with Paul Ekman. She said a lie is not a single utterance. And what Paul Ekman would do is he would study what happens when someone makes one statement that's not true. So if I look at you and I say, I am originally from Italy. That was a lie, because I'm originally from the United States. And she said, people don't do that. You don't walk around making single, untrue utterances to other people. Lies unfold in conversations. You go into a conversation and you want the person you're talking to believe something that's not true, but you work that into the whole conversation. You may very gently build up to it. You may drop it into the conversation. They may challenge you. You may defend it. And the lie kind of rises and falls as part of the topic of the conversation. And she said when you study it as one utterance, that's not how people deceive each other. So, there's the deceiver, there's the target. The target could be one person, the target could be several people. You might try to deceive both your parents. I hope you were good. daughters and sons and didn't do that, but it happens sometimes. I could be trying to deceive all of you. You could all be the targets. But the two communicators in the model are the deceiver and the target. And now sometimes the target responds well to the deceptive message and accepts it. Sometimes not. Sometimes the target becomes suspicious and thinks that they're being deceived. And sometimes this person is telling the truth, which may confuse you, but hold on. If the person listening to the message suspects they're being deceived, then in her model, this person becomes a deceiver. Because that explains how this person, the target, is going to behave. If all of you think I'm being dishonest, even though I'm telling the truth, if you think I'm not from the United States, you may start to behave in ways that show me that you're skeptical. And that then will influence my behavior. So, when there is a speaker who's telling the truth and a listener who believes that they're hearing the truth, this model does not apply. It applies either if the speaker, the sender, the communicator is being deceptive. It applies if the receiver thinks they're being deceived, or if both are true. So that's where the model begins. What her model says is that deceivers behave strategically. Deceivers engage in strategic behavior. Now, what do we mean by strategic? We just mean you have an outcome that you want, and you alter your behavior to try to make that outcome happen. But she says targets also engage in strategic behavior. The deceiver, we've mentioned this already, the deceiver, their strategic behaviors, they want to seem believable. They want to seem honest. They want to seem innocent. The target's strategic behavior is they want to not show that they're being skeptical. They want to not show that they're suspicious. Because commonly, if you think you're being lied to, there are different phrases for this. You play them along. You pretend to believe them because you want them to keep talking until they say something that is so obviously wrong that you can either point it out to them or you can tell somebody else, this is how I knew they were lying. But in her model, the target wants to not show that they suspect the person who is deceptive. Now, there are two kinds of strategic behavior. There's behavior management. Behavior management, she's dividing strategic behavior just into two categories. Behavior management, when you know there are things you do that give away when you're being deceptive, those, trying to control those, that's behavior management. We started today talking about how it's a widely shared belief that if you won't look someone in the eye, that you're lying. Well, very experienced liars know. Me, I'm originally from Italy, and I just looked someone right in the eye while I told a lie. You train yourself to do that, that's behavior management. If I don't look someone in the eye, they're going to know that I'm lying. So I'm going to be careful to look them right in the eye. If Paul Ekman says that microexpressions prove that you're not telling the truth, then you may try to keep your face very still because you don't want the things that show that you're dishonest to show up when you're trying to pitch a lie. Seeming nervous. Maybe you practice, maybe you rehearse telling your lie a few times so you can sound really relaxed and really confident. Behavior management is limiting the things that would make you seem guilty. The other one is image management. Image management. That's not targeted toward any negative behaviors that you want to limit. Instead, image management is you trying to make yourself seem positive. Commonly, says Burgoon's model, when you have a deceptive message, a deceiving message that you want them to accept, you may seem extra friendly, you may seem extra warm and kind, as though you're willing to do nice things for people. You build up your image. You want to seem very pro-social. So put those two strategic behaviors together. Those are common things observed when people are being deceptive. Now this is, I think, when I think of interpersonal deception theory, and I'm not thinking about all the elements, the first place my brain goes is to this one, tuning. Let me explain what it means. When I was younger, and maybe you've experienced these before, we would play music, we would listen to news on the radio, and you had to tune to the station you wanted. And if you didn't tune exactly to it, there'd be lots of static. Interpersonal deception theory, Judy Burgoon's model says, if I'm attempting to persuade you of something that's not true, I will very carefully watch your nonverbals to try to assess, are you believing me? And the longer the conversation goes on, the more likely I am to become believable. Because we're very, very good at tuning to other people. If I'm being too friendly and it's off-putting, then I'll stop being so friendly. If I'm being very forceful and you're not liking it, then I'll stop being so forceful. We adjust based on what we see on the other person. She says, what goes on then, and I just realized, that's in the wrong order. That should be down here. There are two biases that hurt the target, that make it hard for the target to spot deception. I probably should have said this at the beginning, but she agrees. People are 54% accurate at detecting deception, and her conclusion is, don't bother with nonverbals. They'll never help you, consistent with the amount of effort people put into them. But she says the reason that's true, there are two biases that make it hard for the target to spot deception. The first of these is truth bias. Truth bias. We want to believe that people are telling us the truth. We want it very, very badly. And the other bias is visual bias. Visual bias. This has been demonstrated in a number of experimental setups over the years. Here's how you do the experiment. It's so simple. Students have done it for term papers before. You have someone say something. You get several statements from them, some of them truthful, some of them dishonest. You video them, and then you pull the audio off the video, and then you type up a transcript of what they said. And now what you have is a video of them telling the truth or lying, a recording of them telling the truth or lying, and then a written version of what they said, and you present those three to different groups of people. The people who only read what was typed out will be more accurate in detecting the lie. The people who only listen to the recording but can't see the person will be in the middle condition, kind of accurate. And the people who watch the video are the least accurate. We think that it has something to do with truth bias. When you see a human being saying something, you're more likely to think that they're telling the truth. If you read what they said and your attention is focused on the content and not on the full flood of nonverbals coming off them, you become more accurate. Based on these two biases and the idea of tuning, Judy Burgoon has got two bits of advice. If you want to take what her research shows and be more effective at not being deceived, she says, first of all, if you think someone is not being honest with you, cut the conversation short. Make the conversation shorter. Don't keep talking to them, because the longer you talk to them, the more likely they will tune to you and you'll start to believe them. The other thing she says, having to do with visual bias, she says this is something she does herself now when she thinks someone's not telling the truth. She'll just look down at the floor and listen to them talk. She just won't look directly at them. And she says she's not sure that that makes a difference, but that the data on visual bias is so striking and so convincing that she thinks not looking directly at them is probably at least somewhat helpful. A few other claims of interpersonal deception theory before we get on to how it's been challenged. We've actually already talked about leaking in conjunction with the leaking hypothesis. Her model includes the idea that people sometimes will show nonverbals they didn't intend to show, and that's part of what's going on when the target suspects that they're being deceived. Now, the problem with leakage is that could mean someone's telling you a lie and they're trying too hard to be believable, but it could also mean someone's telling you the truth and they can tell that you don't believe them. There is actually a name for this, and this will explain to you, or it will illustrate for you, quite how being an academic can be kind of a complicated and confusing situation. There's a Shakespeare play, Othello. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Shakespeare play Othello, but near the very end of the play, Othello has a very beautiful wife that he loves with all his heart. Her name is Desdemona. And he's told that she's been cheating on him, and he confronts her. He goes right to her and says, "You've been unfaithful to me." And she hasn't been. And it's clear from the play she has not been unfaithful to him. But he is, walking toward her very angrily, accusing her, and she gets upset. And he says, "See, I can tell from how upset you are that you're lying to me," and he kills her. So, the Othello effect is something written about in the deception detection literature. Just about everything that you think is a leaked nonverbal that proves someone's being deceptive works equally well just as proof that they are upset that you're accusing them of lying. And I said this would explain how convoluted being an academic can be, because do you know who named the Othello effect? Paul Ekman. And he has a blog. He put an entry on his blog years ago. Boy, do I wish I had taken a screenshot of it. He put an entry on his blog where he said, the risks of the Othello effect are so severe, it's just not worth it. Nobody should waste their time trying to detect deception from nonverbals. But I went back a few years ago to teach this unit, and I tried to find that blog entry. He took it down. All right. Finishing up Burgoon's model, she says some of the other factors are motivation, familiarity, and suspicion. So the deceiver, if they're highly motivated, then their messages will look different from if they're not very motivated. And we talked about already the motivation impairment effect. She also said it's different when you lie to someone, when you use a deceptive message with someone you know very well. So when you try to lie to your best friend, or when you try to lie to your parents, or anyone in your immediate family, the better you know someone, the more likely you are to produce leakage when you try to be deceptive with them. You leak a lot less if the person you're trying to deceive is not very familiar. And then finally, if you think someone doesn't believe you, if you think they're suspicious, in that circumstance, you're more likely to leak nonverbals that you did not intend for them to be able to observe. And the final variable in this model, some people are just better at it than others. Some people use deception a lot, practice it over the years, and through trial and error, they become very skillful. They learn how to relax themselves so that they don't show nervousness, so they don't inspire skepticism or suspicion. And when the person they're speaking to doesn't seem suspicious, they give off fewer cues. So where we wind up with this model, if you understand it big picture, what you understand is there could be a person telling a lie to someone who believes it. There could be someone not believing they're being told the truth. Or there could be a liar talking to someone who does not believe they're being told the truth. In all three of those circumstances, there's almost a little dance that goes on. The person sending the message is going to try everything possible to try to win over the receiver. And if the person sending the message was telling the truth in the first place, they still try to win over the receiver. And that's her model. Everything else is a variable. There are biases, there's familiarity, there's skill, but that's what it looks like when the possibility of deception enters a conversation. So along comes Timothy Levine. Timothy Levine is a communication professor at the University of Alabama. He's got a different take on nonverbal communication and deception. His is called Truth Default Theory. Truth Default Theory. His first premise: most people don't lie very much. By collecting data a few different ways, he found, let me make sure I get the numbers right, about half of all lies are told by 10% of the population. And about 25%, a quarter of all lies, are told by 1% of the population. So he says a few people are really, really dishonest. Almost everybody else, almost all the time, just tells the truth because it makes your life less complicated. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that culturally dependent? He's actually one of the better researchers when it comes to testing his hypotheses and collecting data all around the world. And he says it's been very consistent on every continent, in every country. There are a few people who tell most of the lies. Most people are truthful nearly all the time. Second thing, we've already mentioned truth bias. Judy Burgoon includes truth bias as part of her model. He says it's not just part of the model, it is the model. Truth bias is the single strongest factor at work when people are being deceived or when they think that they are being deceived. He says in all of his data, he has never, ever, ever seen a population of people who did not have an overpowering truth bias. We want to think people are telling us the truth. If someone tells us a blatant lie, if I stand up here and say, I have 3 legs and a built-in helicopter, then you're going to know that I'm not telling you the truth. But if I say something that could be true, if I say, I have been in Japan now for 4 months, and I have had natto for breakfast every single morning since I arrived. Do you believe me? It's actually true. I don't know what I like natto. That's just... Anyway. Truth bias is very, very strong. We want to believe that people are telling us the truth. For a while, Levine even thought about publishing truth bias as a cognitive thinking mistake, kind of like confirmation bias. But then he realized he put those two premises together. Most people tell the truth most of the time, and we have a bias where we tend to think people are telling us the truth. He now thinks truth bias just makes communication more efficient. Because most people tell the truth most of the time, it speeds things up if you assume people are telling the truth. Now that's the beginning of his theory. It goes on a long way from there. Spotting that someone is telling the truth, believing a truthful statement when you hear it, and recognizing a lie are two different tasks, and they're not related to each other. This is Levine's claim. I came up with a really weird illustration of this. We have a song in the United States that young children are taught called Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. What if I, as an experiment, wanted to see who in here could row a boat the fastest? And so I had all of you, maybe we have a little canal out here, I had you row a boat 100 meters while I click a stopwatch. And then when you get out, I have you sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat as fast as you can, and I timed that as well. And I put those combined times down, and I say, that's how we know how fast you can row a boat. Well, that second task, singing that song, the word boat may be in it, but it has nothing to do with how fast you can row a boat. And if I put those two times together, I'm measuring two things that have nothing to do with each other. Timothy Levine says, recognizing that what someone said was truthful and recognizing a lie are completely different. And we are very accurate when someone tells us the truth and we recognize it as the truth. And we are very, very inaccurate when we recognize or when we try to make the decision whether someone is telling us a lie. A lot of the research says that we are 54% accurate in recognizing whether statements are true or not, and he says that's the wrong way to put it. We're actually about 70% accurate in spotting the truth, and we're way down in the 30s when it comes to spotting a lie. But every time people do the study, they'll have 20 statements in there, 10 of them true, 10 of them false. And then they just take the whole score, which is measuring two things that have little to do with each other. So how does he make the case for this? This is probably the hardest part of his theory to explain. I'm going to try. We have a language barrier. You're smart people. Work hard, and I think you'll get this. What if I had up here a jar, and the jar is not see-through? And I said, in this jar are a bunch of balls. The balls are either white or black. And you're going to reach in and you're going to pull out a ball. What's the probability that the ball is white or black? And you might think, okay, well, it's 50-50. There are two options. But what if I told you there are 100 balls in the jar, 99 of them are white, one of them is black? For you to answer the question, the probability that you'll pull out a white or black ball, you have to know how many of each are in the jar. That's base rate. He says you have to take into account in deciding how accurate people are in telling the truth or telling a lie, how many truthful statements do they hear? How many lies do they hear? How many lies are being told? How many truthful statements are being made? So one example for this, let's imagine that you're a police detective. And down at the police station, you're interviewing people who've been arrested under suspicion of committing a crime. How many lies do you think you hear in a day? I'm betting quite a few. On the other hand, what if you work at the airport and you're a security screener? Most of the people coming through the airport are traveling. They don't want to get in trouble. They don't want anything complicated to happen. What's the base rate for how many lies you hear? Probably not very many. So he says, where most of these other studies have gone wrong is they have not considered base rate. Most of the time, most of the statements people make to you are truthful. And you spot them as truthful, and base rate has to be included in assessing whether people are accurate. His model makes one very simple claim. We're more accurate when people are telling the truth most of the time. And the more dishonest statements you add, our accuracy goes down. He says it's not an accident that almost all the deception studies have half-true statements and half-false statements, and our accuracy is 50-50. Because we get the false ones wrong way more often than we do the true ones. Now he does say, he explains the 4%, why it's not a perfect 50-50, and he says that is demeanor. You may have been wondering, why am I even talking about Timothy Levine in a class on nonverbal communication? This is the part where he gets nonverbal. He says, actually, the judgment whether someone's telling the truth or not has not that much to do with the content of what was said. A lot of it has to do with how the target assesses the demeanor of the speaker, of the deceiver. And by demeanor, we mean someone who seems honest, Levine's research says, tends to have these traits. And that's not that different, honestly, from Burgoon's model. Only Burgoon is talking about strategic behavior. People try to look this way. Levine says this is a judgment that the receiver, that the target makes. If you seem confident, pleasant, engaged, and your explanations are pretty plausible, based on that, that's what distinguishes, that's what makes a difference, that little 4%. Other people at times, and if you're still writing, well, I'll leave it there because some people are writing it down rapidly. The slides are going to be up in the Moodle, so if I were to switch the slide and it were no longer there, you could get it later. But he also has found from his research the elements that he says make up dishonest demeanor, and people who have these characteristics are more likely to be judged as deceptive, even incidentally if they're telling the truth. And again, they seem to show lack of confidence. They seem to show they really are kind of a failure of strategic behavior. They play right in to the folk wisdom that you can tell that someone is being dishonest if they seem nervous. Whereas the research saying non-behavioral measures of truthfulness and deception are far, far more accurate. Don't get hung up on the nonverbals. Pay attention to their content. All right. This will be up later if you didn't get it all. But where that brings us to, Levine made the very bold claim that if his model is correct, that Judy Burgoon is dead wrong. So this became Burgoon versus Levine. They did this publicly. You have to be an academic to fully appreciate it, but they don't like each other. They took some cheap shots at each other. As an academic slap fight, it was one of the better ones I've seen. So we're going to spend just a few minutes on it. Levine said that the major elements of Burgoon's theory, strategic behavior and tuning, make no sense. Because he said, in the middle of an encounter, in the middle of a conversation, we can't tell accurately. Our accuracy is very low. Skepticism has very little to do with the behavior of the deceiver, of the communicator. It has more to do with demeanor, and it has more to do with the power of truth bias, which is the third bullet point. Truth bias, he said, is more powerful than anything, more powerful than interactivity. He said it really doesn't matter if you interact with the other person a lot or a little. You remember Judy Burgoon's advice? If you think someone's lying to you, cut the conversation short. Timothy Levine said that's dead wrong. It doesn't matter at all. Or if it makes a difference, it's such a tiny difference that it's not consistent. Well, Burgoon came along, and she said, first of all, you've completely misunderstood what interpersonal deception theory is. She says, Timothy Levine is the one who's hung up on accuracy. I'm not that concerned with accuracy. My model is trying to show when you think someone is accusing you of being dishonest, how do you behave? Those behaviors are similar to someone who is being dishonest. because there's the tension between the sender and the receiver. Do you believe me or not? Deceivers want to be believed. Truthful people want to be believed. When there's the possibility you're not being believed, the conversation changes, and it's a different kind of conversation. She then went on to say, every other researcher who studies deception has a problem called ecological validity. Ecological validity. I don't know if you've ever noticed that a lot of the experiments done in psychology, communication, the social sciences seem really artificial. Her complaint from the beginning about Paul Ekman was that Paul Ekman would have people say dishonest things while looking into a camera, and he would take a picture of them. In other words, Paul Ekman had them lie to an inanimate object. Well, when's the last time you lied to an object? So she would say all of his findings have no value because his participants were not talking to another person. She also says Levine's research was just people making statements and other people deciding if they were true. Her research was always two people having a conversation. She would sit them down in comfortable chairs, give them something to talk about. She would put little wrinkles in there where one of them was told, say dishonest things. But it was always two people talking, having a conversation. So that was one of her answers to Levine. But then this is the one that I thought was pretty revealing. She said, you can see it in my data. And here, she said, you can see the adjustments. Now, this is one of her experiments where through the conversation, the deceiver, the person assigned to be the deceiver, was told to disclose, to tell the other person facts about themselves. The two people in this experiment never met each other, and the one who was leading the conversation was supposed to tell things like, where are you from? What is your hobby? Things like that. And in this particular situation, the challenge they were given was tell them 3 true things and then 3 false things, but don't give away that they're false, then 3 more that are true, then 3 more that are false. So this blue line, the speaker gave a score for how truthful what they said was. And the first 3 you'll see, they're very truthful. Next 3, they scored very low. That was not very truthful. The red line is how the listener scored the same thing. They were asked, do you think they're telling the truth or not? And you see, the red line goes up and down. And she said, that proves, she also showed the other condition where it was make the false statements first, and then the true statements, and then the false statements, and then the true statements. And she said, do you see that the red line goes up and down? If Timothy Levine was correct, the red line should be straight. But as honesty rises and falls, the listener, the target, their perception of honesty rises and falls. Now, if that's observable in the data, that proves Timothy Levine is wrong. And Timothy Levine came back and said, no, your data doesn't prove I'm wrong. Your data proves I'm right. And this is the part where I want to show you this is what social science really looks like. Because he said 2 things. First, he said, let me go back here. His claim is that truth bias is stronger than anything else. Truth bias is stronger than interaction. Truth bias just swamps everything. And he defines truth bias as, if truth bias was not operating, at some point that red line would have to go below 5. They took all 12 statements, and you'll notice the line never even goes below 6. The most dishonest statement anyone made, they said, was at least 60% likely it was truthful. And then, you look at the other one, this one never goes below 7. When the person they're listening to is blatantly lying to them, they still think it's 70% likely that it's truthful. So his claim is truth bias is bigger than anything else. His other claim, which I think is even more devastating for Burgoon, he says, I've said all along, people are the most accurate when they're hearing a lot of true statements.
Now on this chart, we can define accuracy very simply when the red line and the blue line are close together. When they both agree on how to score the statement, that's accuracy. Where are they close together? On the true statements. And then look at the false statements, they're far apart. And Levine pointed at that and said, that's my argument. We're accurate when we assess truth. We're not accurate when we assess dishonesty. And you can see it even more strikingly on this one. Accuracy on the true statements, wild inaccuracy on the dishonest statements. So, where do we wind up after all of that? After all of that, we can say both of them agree. Trying to read nonverbals to tell whether someone is being honest or not is a waste of time. It's a losing strategy. They both believe in non-behavioral ways to try to detect deception. They both also believe that Paul Ekman's approach to detecting deception from nonverbals is deeply, deeply flawed and deeply problematic. Now I'm going to pause here because I've dumped a lot on you, and I want to see if you have questions you want to ask me. I have about one last thing I want to include at the end, but what is on your mind after hearing all that? Yes, ma'am.
You said that you're after you said that you do have knowledge in nonverbal communication. Why do you think?
Oh, I see. So the question was, when I went in to be on the jury, and I said I had knowledge in nonverbal communication, and they dismissed me from the jury, the question was, why do I think I was dismissed? I think it's because the lawyers were questioning all the people who were invited to be on the jury, who were summoned to jury duty, and all of those people kept saying, well, I decide whether I believe someone based on everything we've talked about today. Do they look nervous? Will they look you in the eye? And the lawyers liked that because they're used to that. That's how they've operated for their whole career. And they will talk in their opening or in their closing argument, not the opening argument. They'll talk in their closing argument to the jury. They'll say, you saw that witness. You saw how nervous they looked. You saw they didn't believe what they were saying. But I told those lawyers, if I'm on that jury, I'm going to tell them that's not reliable. The fact that that witness looked nervous could just mean they're on the witness stand in a courtroom and it made them nervous. It doesn't mean that they're lying. And the lawyers did not want the other jury members to hear that because it made the lawyer's job harder. Okay, very good question. Are there more? We will get to the very last bit of what I wanted to share with you on this subject, and then we will see who is in the mood after a fairly grim and grumpy class to be in a class picture. This man. This man's name, John Reed. John, middle initial E, Reed. Only picture of him I could find was the one they published after he died in memoriam. Back in the 1950s, he was a police detective and an interrogator. And when people were arrested and accused of crimes, back in the 1950s in the United States, it was pretty common that the police would beat them if necessary until they confessed. It's not a happy part of history, but it's a fact, very well documented. In the 1950s, the academic field of psychology was still fairly new and not well known. What he thought he could do is instead of beating accused criminals, he could use psychological pressure to get them to tell the truth and confess to their crimes. So, there was a man named Darrell Parker who came home from work one day to find his wife had been killed during the day. Well, the police found inconsistencies in his story, so they brought him in for questioning, and Reed interrogated him, and this is where Reed first used his theory. He hooked Daryl Parker up to a lie detector, a polygraph machine. And no matter what Parker answered to any question, Reed said out loud, "You're lying." Said it to things that were truthful, said to everything, "You're lying." Carried on an interrogation like that went on for hours and started to say, your wife was not a good wife to you. Your wife didn't take care of your needs, and you got frustrated, and finally you couldn't take it anymore, and by that point she had it coming. Now at that point, that interrogation had been going on for 9 hours. And Daryl Parker crumbled emotionally and confessed to killing his wife. The very next day, he took the confession back, but it didn't matter. At the trial, the jury was told he had confessed. They found him guilty, sentenced him to life in prison. He was later freed after someone else confessed to the murder. John Reed is the person behind what's called the Reed technique, which to this day is taught to detectives in the United States. Now, a number of large cities and states have outlawed it, no longer allow it. But I would say probably more than half of the United States, this is still the way police investigations happen. And there's a serious justice issue going on here. You may wonder, why am I bringing this up in a nonverbal communication class? Because John Reed taught, let me give you the basic method that he taught you ought to use when you interrogate, and then we'll get to the nonverbal part. He said, you first of all, just kind of ask some open-ended questions, just to get a sense of who you're dealing with. Then you confront them. You tell them, you know that they committed the crime, you know that they're lying, you have all the evidence that they committed the crime and that they're lying, and you bear down on them very hard. And then you switch again, and you tell them, it's understandable that you committed this crime. You deserve to commit this crime. You're being treated unfairly. We can get this taken care of if you'll just confess. The thing about the Reed technique that they're very plain about, it's not about catching the person who committed the crime. It's about getting a confession. You're supposed to use the Reed technique when you're positive you have the right person. The Reed technique makes them confess because then you can win the trial in court. And part of the Reed technique is nonverbal cues that they say prove that you are dishonest. I'm going to give you just 5 of them. If you sniff, if you're doing that during the interrogation, then you're being dishonest. If you pick at your clothes, then you're being dishonest. If you look down, these are in the Reed technique manual. If you cross your arms, and the one that I've heard students quote to me the most over the years, because it still shows up in media coverage, if you touch your face. If you're being asked about something and you touch your face a lot, that means you're lying. Partly, I guess this is a warning. If any of you travel to the United States, there's a reason college students, young adults in the United States are told, if a police officer ever starts to talk to you about a crime that's been committed, don't talk to them. Get a lawyer. If you're brought in for questioning, don't cooperate. Get a lawyer. They're not trying to find the person who committed the crime. They're trying to get a confession. They develop a theory of who they think did it based on their gut instinct, and if they get a confession and a conviction, that's their job. And there have been a whole lot of false convictions based on that. I'm going to tell you real quick what the leading alternative is. It was developed in England. It's being widely used in Canada, and it's starting to catch on in the United States. It's called the Peace Protocol. If this interests you at all, this subject, and if you did a Google search for the Reed technique and the Peace Protocol, and you put those together, you would find what was written about this. The Peace Protocol is interesting because, in the first place, investigators who are trained in the Peace Protocol are forbidden, as Rule 1, you are not allowed to draw any conclusions from nonverbals. They are also taught visible anxiety has no correlation with deception. None. They then they have very long open-ended interviews with the suspect. And they have to first examine the evidence very carefully, because what they do in the peace protocol, they'll ask the suspect about inconsistencies in their explanation. They'll say, this crime was committed on the evening of Thursday the 12th. Can you tell me what you were doing on Thursday the 12th? And as the suspect tells their story, the interrogator has to know the evidence well enough to say, well, now you said that you used your cell phone, but now we have cell phone records saying that your cell phone was in another state. Can you explain that to me? And that's how they put it. Can you explain that to me? They video the whole thing. They make the whole video available to the defense. And then what they do in court, they take the parts of the video where the suspect is trying to explain things that cannot be explained, and they show it to the jury. We confronted the suspect with the evidence, and this is what they said. And the jury watches that. And the defense is allowed to show other parts of the video if they want. Nothing is done with nonverbals. It's all done with the words of the defendant. And that is what deception detection looks like when you don't base it on nonverbals. All right. That gets me to the end of what I want to say about nonverbals and detecting deception. It's not just something that happens in the criminal justice system. It's something that happens in workplaces when managers try to resolve disputes between people. It happens in homes and in families. But I want to send you out into the world thinking. You're far better off paying attention to content. Nonverbal clues that someone might be deceptive are just not a promising strategy for you to pursue. Okay, that's probably the grumpiest class I will teach the whole time that I'm over here, but it is something that just bugs me. I am going to kill the recorder, and actually,